You mentioned talking about masks, which is something that I think about a great deal. I go to schools and school visits, and before I was doing this, I was in education and teaching, and I like going to schools, and kids are great, and they ask great questions. And one of them, a kid asked me once, you know, what's the thing that most or do you scare yourself when you write? And I said, yeah, sometimes, you know, you do. And then, but also, what's the thing that most scared you, you know, when you were growing up, or what were you scared of? And so, and it triggered a memory of the old Alfred Hitchcock show, which my parents did not allow us to watch because they thought it wasn't appropriate for whatever age we were at the time. But of course, you know, babysitter came, and there was the one where there's a young woman on a bus, and there are two people, and one is an obvious crazy, raving maniac, murderer, you know, drooling, awful, you know, and I don't know whether it looked like he was carrying a knife. He isn't. The other was, you know, a businessman returning home from the city. It's in New York, briefcase and so forth. And it's dark, it's late, and she's coming to her stop. She's getting more and more scared. And the businessman says, "Don't worry, I get off near here too, and I'll walk you home. Don't worry." And he does. They get off together, and the raving lunatic is sort of a couple of blocks behind them, but approaching, and they get to her door, and the businessman suddenly turns and attacks her, and the raving lunatic joins him, and she says, "But wait," and he says, "Well, you know, he's with me." And it was just that sudden, I mean, it was that terror of somebody who looked fine, normal, so forth, could have behind the mask that. And you always hear it, you know, whenever they dig up the bodies, and they say, "He seemed like such a nice guy, and he took, you know, my mail in and whatever, and then he's got 18 bodies in the backyard."
Well, yes, I have interviewed Ann Rule on this program, and, you know, she got her start because she worked with Ted Bundy long before anybody knew who Ted Bundy was or what it was he did, and she saw him entirely masked and never realized, you know, all
so
of
the
that.
difference between playing around with the appearance and reality is something that Faith is interested in, and that I'm interested in. With her, it's sort of, she's the surface of the pond, and she's always getting that stick and kind of poking around to see what's underneath. But I think, you know, in mysteries, that's what happens. You know, there's this constant interchange between that, how people appear and how they really are. And to me, that's the greatest terror. When I talk to kids, I say it's, you know, it's like having the false friend. You know, the friend you really thought was a good friend, and then the friend stabs you in the back, and you take it to the nth degree, and that's, you know, a murderer. You know, someone you thought. You know.
I think that's one reason that I myself get really bored with lots of thrillers and with serial killer novels, where they're, you know, one of the narrative voices is the serial killer, and the other is, and, you know, I don't want to know.
No,
I really miss the misdirection, and that you know, I want the mask, etc. And I am not. I realize that the classic mystery has changed a lot, and as you've pointed out, you get, you know, it's more about setting, it's richer and more textured in place, and the characters, whether an ensemble or solo, and more often ensemble, are presented more deeply, and lots of the plot, maybe too often, in fact, arises from their personal lives and interactions, which is a danger,
is a real danger, real pitfall.
But nonetheless, I still find them more interesting than when the author shows his or her hand at the very beginning, and then it just turns into a contest. Now, sometimes people bring it off really well. My husband is wild about Eye of a Needle, the foresight, and there are certainly thrillers where, you know, the suspense is breathtaking, and you can follow it, rooting for one guy or the other, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I always like that bit of misdirection.
No, I do too. I do too. And it's a pitting of wits. You're sort of pitting your wits against the writer of the book, and, you know, it's fun. That's fun and intriguing. But the other kind, I have a friend who calls them howdunnits, where, you know, in the first chapter, you sort of essentially see the crime and see the killer,
right.
and then the whole rest of the book is just, you know, and the author knows, and everybody else in the book is in the dark. Well, you know, that's not so intriguing for me to read those.
Well, there are people. I've never been a huge fan of the locked room murder, for example, because I am not totally given over to process.
Yeah,
and
right.
a locked room murder
Right.
sometimes involves, you know, a very intricate sort of.
I know.
And I'm not. Don't want to. I'm a very fast reader. I don't want to slow down from that in part.
I know.
So there is something, you know, for everyone. But you obviously, what is The Body in the Moonlight? Your 11th?
Yes.
So, I mean, you've had a very successful series of novels,
Yeah.
and you've done interesting things. You started in Alfred. I wanted to call it Alfred. I see that
It's Alfred. Alfred is what it is.
But you call it.
No, I said it's Alfred.
You kind of gulped the A, so
well,
it sounds more like Alfred than Alfred.
I think Geraldine was saying, I didn't want to make it seem like.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, in any case, here she is in a small town in
right.
Massachusetts with her minister husband. And you have, twice gone to the coast of Maine,
yeah.
The Body and the Kelp.
They pretty much alternated. I decided in the beginning I would alternate the locale in order to keep it fresh.
Right.
Make it fresh for me to write, fresh for people to read. So I created this mythic island in Penobscot Bay.
And so your second book, The Body and the Kelp,
The Body and the Kelp went there, and then we were back in Alfred for The Body and the Bouillon.
Where again, Faith was cooking. That's your Christmas time crime.
That was the Christmas book where
right.
you know where everybody dies. But
yes, it's not very jolly, but you are
where
seasonal.
she pitches. Well, that was a funny book because I again created a completely mythic. It was one of an assisted living complex, all grouped around an old house that had been there, a large house, a mansion, and everybody in the area afterwards said, "Oh, well, that's this place," and I had never even heard of it. And I went finally and looked at it, and it was virtually identical to the whole layout and the description. It was a very strange book. But in that book, the illness has struck, and they really need someone in the kitchen to help out because the cook has become ill. And
right,
so
and the nexus between food and death is, is closer. Not all of your books, even though Faith is a caterer, not all of your books involve people.
Only two of the books involve anything to do with poison in the food. So there are poisons in other respects, but not only these two in the food.
Right, so you haven't gone to the well too often. Now your fourth book, which I found, I personally loved it, but then of course I would, is that Faith and Tom are off to France, and not to Paris, but to Lyon. Gastronomic capital.
Yeah.
Why did you pick Lyon?
I picked Lyon because my husband had a sabbatical there, and we lived there. My son was 2. We lived there for that whole entire year. He was working on some research with a French team. And
what is it? Pardon me if I interject here. What is it he does? I've never asked you.
Oh, I thought, okay. He is an experimental psychologist, and his field is visual perception. And he was working for the French government, and they were doing a joint research project on the effects of motion on vision, and he's at MIT, although he is now, you probably don't know this, he just retired, and then is rehired to not doing research anymore, but doing some of his other things. And they have this great child care situation there, and my child was in this darling little, what they call, a creche in the morning, and he would go off with a goûter bag, and French school children, this snack that you bring in these little drawstring bags with their names on them, they're so cute, is a baguette cut in half with a slab of chocolate, good French chocolate, and if that's their snack. I'm thinking of peanut butter sandwiches or something to send with them. And one of our friends, my husband had a postdoctoral student who was French from Lyon and was connected with that laboratory. I said, well, first of all, they didn't know where you could get peanut butter in Lyon. And then the other thing was, they said, no, you go and you get the chocolat and you put it in the baguette. I said, you put the chocolate in the baguette. Well,
wonderful. I would have thought Goose fan, but anyway,
and I wrote The Body in the Belfry that year while we were there.
So you wrote the first book, The Body in the Belfry, in Lyon?
This was years and years ago, 1985. 5, on a manual typewriter. Finished most of the book that year, and we came home for 6 months, and the project hadn't, my husband did his teaching, and then we went back for another year. So we were really there a long time.